and that is that the potential for Israel to become extinct as a state and a society through mass immigration.
Welcome, curious minds, to The Deep Dive. Today, we're really plunging into a story that made headlines with a huge bang. But according to some, let's say, highly provocative sources we've looked at, it might be hiding an even bigger secret behind all that smoke and mirrors. We're talking about that recent, very high-profile U.S. bombing operation in Iran. You probably heard the price tag, reportedly a staggering $100 million. The official narrative, the one that got pushed out everywhere, was, well, that this was a decisive precision strike, the target. Iranian nuclear facilities. Simple enough, right? But what if that's not the full story? What if it's not even really close to the truth?
That's exactly right. Our deep dive into the sources for this topic, it really reveals a startling counter-narrative, particularly from Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Now, he's a highly respected, though often controversial, voice in military analysis. And we also have insights from places like Salt Cube Analytics. And these sources, they present an explosive claim that this huge military action, this $100 million operation, wasn't a genuine military strike at all, but rather it was a meticulously staged PR stunt.
A PR stunt. Wow. With $100 million in bombs and, global headlines, that's a truly staggering claim. And it just fundamentally challenges everything we thought we knew about that operation. So it's pretty important we emphasize this right at the start. Our role here today is to unpack these specific, highly controversial viewpoints exactly as they're presented in our source material. We're here to help you understand the arguments being put forth by Macgregor and others, to explore the underlying motivations they suggest drove such an, audacious deception, and to really delve into the profound implications this could have for U.S. foreign policy and, America's standing on the world stage. We are definitely not here to endorse these claims ourselves, not at all. We're just reporting on the content provided, trying to help you navigate these complex and often hidden forces shaping global events. Think of this as maybe your shortcut to being well-informed. We're inviting you to consider perspectives that go well beyond the mainstream narrative. Okay, let's dive in. So let's start right there with Colonel Macgregor's immediate assessment of that bombing run in Iran. And frankly, it was quite astonishing. He dismissed it outright, stated pretty unequivocally that it had no bona fide military purchase. Now, when a seasoned military strategist like him makes such a definitive statement, well, you have to pay attention. He characterized the whole event as nothing more than a training mission with live ammunition. And he added, almost chillingly, that it was fortunate there were no casualties or, significant damage to actual targets, which immediately raises a critical question, doesn't it?
It really does.
If the targets were supposed to be these Iranian nuclear facilities, and the damage was minimal, no casualties, does that suggest that U.S. or maybe Allied intelligence knew before the bombs even fell that those tunnels were empty? Because if they did know they were empty, well, that profoundly shifts the narrative, right? It lends significant weight to his whole PR stunt conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here is how Macgregor, through his analysis in these sources, just peels back the layers of that official narrative. He contrasts the military reports, the ones allegedly indicating empty tunnels, with President Trump's reported statements, proclaiming the U.S. had totally obliterated their nuclear program.
Right, I remember that phrase.
Macgregor views this as a classic example of something he calls, when the truth is ugly, only a lie could be beautiful. It's about crafting a narrative. One that's not necessarily accurate, but, it's far more palatable, much more politically expedient for public consumption. And he asserts that the underlying motivation for this alleged lie was a way for Trump to, quote, get out from under the demand that his donors are making. The demand, according to Macgregor, that he joined the war against Iran by attacking them and rescuing Israel from its perilous state.
Wow. So that's a direct link he's making.
A very direct link. It's a profound and, yes, controversial claim, directly linking what looks like a singular military action to a much larger, more pervasive theme, external influence on U.S. foreign policy, essentially suggesting the operation was, more about managing political pressure than actual military necessity.
And it wasn't just President Trump's public statements that apparently raised Macgregor's eyebrows in these sources. He points to the apparent discomfort of the Air Force four-star general, the new chairman, during that news conference where the operation was discussed. Macgregor describes the general as looking less than entirely comfortable with everything he was saying, noting these subtle nonverbal cues that, maybe to an astute observer, suggested an awareness that the official line was misleading.
Yeah, sometimes it's not what's said, but how it's said.
Exactly. It's that unspoken language that can maybe betray a deeper, more complicated truth, even from those at the highest levels who are tasked with delivering the message.
And building on this powerful idea of a staged operation, other sources we looked at, specifically Salt Cube Analytics, they seem to corroborate this notion. The idea that these strikes were far from some spontaneous response to an imminent threat. Instead, their analysis claims the strikes were actually planned years ago, part of a much grander long-term ploy to, quote, reshape the whole region.
Planned years ago, not just a reaction.
That's the claim. So this wasn't about an immediate danger or some reactive measure. It was, as these sources suggest, a deliberate, premeditated strategy with broad geopolitical objectives. They elaborate further on what they describe as a month-long deception campaign, run jointly, they say, by Israel and the U.S. And this campaign, they contend, was meticulously designed to trick Tehran, to make them believe diplomacy was still genuinely at work, creating a false sense of security.
And this wasn't just like quiet backroom diplomacy, was it? The sources describe something much more elaborate.
Oh yeah, what they call intricate diplomatic theater. This apparently included carefully orchestrated media discussions, leaks about a supposed rift, a disagreement between Trump and Netanyahu, seemingly designed to convey a message of distance maybe, even when deeper cooperation was allegedly underway.
That's quite the production.
And one really striking detail mentioned in the sources is Netanyahu himself pretending to be on vacation at a critical juncture. A move apparently designed to deflect attention, lower Iran's guard. The strategic goal behind all this intricate deception we learned from these sources, it wasn't just bombing static infrastructure. That wasn't the main point. It was to lull Iran's military leadership into a false sense of security, keep them concentrated in one place for what is chillingly referred to as decapitation of their command structure.
Decapitation, so taking out the leadership, not the buildings.
Exactly. It suggests a deeply calculated strategy, using the appearance of diplomacy as a kind of feint, a cover for tactical military aim, to neutralize key leadership, rather than just hitting empty tunnels.
And when you look at the physical evidence described in these sources, does it back this up?
Well, it strongly reinforces what these sources describe as the minimal impact maximum optics theory. Satellite images, according to these reports, show mostly surface damages to the Fordo enrichment site. Now, this is critically significant because, as you know, the Fordo facility is notoriously built deep into granite mountains, reportedly 80 meters underground. It was specifically designed to withstand even a nuclear attack.
Right, it's famously hardened.
Exactly. So the implication from Macgregor's perspective in these analyses is clear. Conventional bombs, even the most powerful bunker busters that America boasts about, they simply cannot penetrate that depth. They couldn't have done it. So the conclusion drawn in these sources is that the Iranian nuclear material and technology, the true targets of any genuine strike, remain entirely intact, suggesting the attack achieved, well, minimum damage to the actual critical infrastructure.
So from this perspective, it just loops right back to that initial PR stunt idea, doesn't it? The attack, these sources contend, primarily served as a highly visible way for President Trump to claim a decisive victory, maybe even, as they suggest, angle for a Nobel Peace Prize, while at the same time providing a much-needed off-ramp for pro-Israeli lobbyists and political donors who were apparently relentlessly pressuring him for direct, large-scale war with Iran.
It's painted as a very calculated political move.
Yeah, designed to satisfy both domestic political ambitions and powerful external demands, rather than being driven by genuine military necessity or some imminent threat. What really stands out here is how this isn't just about a single military action anymore. It's about a fundamentally different way of viewing geopolitics, where perception, political maneuvering, even, well, theatrical performance become as crucial, maybe even more so, than the actual military objective. It really forces you to ask, how many other shows like this might be playing out on the world stage right now, cloaked in official narratives?
And this complex understanding of the Iran bombing, as presented in the source material, brings us to a far broader and certainly more contentious claim from Colonel Macgregor, his central assertion that U.S. foreign policy has become, quote, dangerously subservient to Israeli interests, is essentially transforming America, in his view, into a tool of Israeli foreign policy. Now, this isn't exactly a new concern within certain analytical circles, but Macgregor argues it's reached a critical and highly perilous state, pushing the U.S. towards actions that, he believes, do not serve its own national interest.
And he paints a pretty grim picture of Israel's internal situation as the driver for this.
Yes, according to his assessment in the sources, he suggests they are on the verge of running out of missiles, their economy is in ruins, and they are potentially facing a profound collapse due to ongoing conflict and internal pressures. He specifically cites an Israeli official, Smotrich, reportedly stating, "We've got maybe a week left," indicating severe resource depletion and an urgent, desperate need for immediate U.S. intervention.
A week left, that's incredibly stark.
It is. And it's presented as the context for this perceived urgency. He also points to reports, mentioned in the sources, of a substantial portion of Israel reportedly destroyed, despite official denials. A situation he claims led Prime Minister Netanyahu to be, quote, pleading with Trump to get into the game quickly. This portrays Israel, in these analyses, as a state in genuine distress, desperate for external rescue and immediate U.S. military engagement.
And he goes even further than that, doesn't he? Mentioning something about extinction.
He does. He raises the unsettling potential for Israel to become extinct as a state and a society through mass immigration, noting that, according to his sources, people are already leaving, and the Israeli government is reportedly attempting to prevent this exodus. So this isn't just about military strategy or political alliances in his view. It's framed as being about existential survival, which, if true, would certainly drive the kind of desperate actions and fervent calls for aid and intervention that Macgregor describes.
Okay, so if that's the alleged motivation, what's the mechanism? How does this influence supposedly work, according to Macgregor?
The mechanism, as Macgregor details it in the sources, is rooted in the immense power and financial sway of what he calls the Israel lobby. He specifically highlights enormous amounts of money poured into U.S. election campaigns, not just for the presidency, but also for House and Senate races. Big money involved. And he attributes the current administration's compliance with these policies directly to these financial ties, explicitly mentioning contributions from figures like Mrs. Adelson, and asserting quite bluntly that there's nothing more reliable than a man that can be bought with cold, hard cash. That's his take.
That's a very direct accusation of influence.
Extremely direct. And this system, he explains, isn't just about campaign donations in his view. It also offers access to benefits that reach into the financial firms in New York City for what he calls serious acolytes of this specific foreign policy direction. So from Macgregor's perspective presented in these sources, this isn't merely isolated acts of influence, it's a deeply systemic issue that shapes who gets elected and what policies get pursued.
And it goes beyond just the financial ties, right? He talks about a more overt prioritization.
Yes, what Macgregor describes as an almost open, overt prioritization of Israel at the highest levels of U.S. government. He points to that striking and widely circulated clip of a State Department spokesperson declaring America the greatest country on earth next to Israel. Macgregor interprets this not just as some casual opinion, but as a prerequisite, the precondition for service in the government.
Precondition? Wow.
Implying that such a public stance isn't just accepted, but actually required for those in power to maintain their positions. It's seen by him as a very public signal of where allegiances are expected to lie. And it speaks volumes in his analysis about the perceived power dynamics.
He mentions another example too, doesn't he? Something at a convention.
He does. He recalls a vivid and, to him, shocking moment at the Republican convention. He describes observing a giant Israeli flag on the wall and above it, Israel First, with a, quote, plump gentleman in a suit leading cheers for Israel First. This, he argues, wasn't some subtle hint. It was a public, unequivocal declaration of this policy direction, making it crystal clear for anyone paying attention that Israel's priorities were front and center at the highest levels of American political discourse. From Macgregor's viewpoint, this is no longer a nuanced behind-the-scenes influence. It's presented as an open embrace of Israel's priorities, seemingly, in his view, at the expense of America's own best interests.
But what's interesting, considering this narrative of, well, subservience, is how President Trump publicly reacted sometimes. He seemed angry with Israel at points. He's quoted saying things like, "I'm not happy with Israel. You don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them." That sounds like real pushback, doesn't it?
It does sound like it on the surface.
Like a leader asserting his own will.
Right. But Macgregor, in these sources, quickly dismisses this as mere bluster, or, quote, a load of something, just designed for public consumption. He asserts that Trump doesn't really have much to say about what the Israelis do, and that, in his view, Trump will come back online very quickly when it's deemed appropriate by those who allegedly wield this influence.
So more diplomatic theater, perhaps.
That seems to be the implication from Macgregor's analysis.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the public display of anger is part of that performance we discussed earlier, designed to manage perceptions, provide political cover, rather than signal genuine disagreement or a shift in policy.
And this alleged deference to Israeli interests, does it extend to intelligence matters too?
Apparently so, according to Macgregor's assessment. We see this alleged deference seemingly overriding even internal U.S. intelligence assessments. Macgregor contrasts Tulsi Gabbard's intelligence assessment, which stated that Iran is not actively building a nuclear weapon, with Netanyahu's repeated and very public claims that they are. Now, when confronted with Gabbard's view, Trump reportedly dismissed it, saying simply, "I don't care what she said." This, according to Macgregor's analysis, illustrates a consistent pattern, prioritizing Israeli narratives and political objectives, even when they appear to contradict or override the U.S. intelligence community's own findings. It underscores, from his perspective, the profound and deeply ingrained commitment to this policy direction, regardless of any dissenting intelligence.
And it's a commitment that, according to Macgregor, runs incredibly deep. He suggests it's almost like a foundational bargain, not just policy alignment.
Yes, he makes the highly controversial claim that Trump would not be in the White House today if it were not for wealthy Jewish billionaires allied with their friend Netanyahu. The promise, he asserts, the mandate given, was to take on and destroy Iran, that this was a clear and fundamental precondition for that support.
A precondition for the presidency itself.
That's the stark claim presented in the source material. It suggests the influence isn't just about shaping policy day to day, but is literally rooted in the very mechanisms of political power and ascent to the highest office.
It certainly puts a very different spin on the phrase America first, doesn't it? If America is perceived, in these circles Macgregor describes, as a tool or maybe an instrument, rather than the primary actor in certain crucial foreign policy decisions. Okay, so if America's foreign policy is perceived by someone like Macgregor as dangerously subservient, driven by these powerful external forces, what does that mean for how the U.S. is viewed on the global stage?
Well, Colonel Macgregor offers a stark and, frankly, quite alarming assessment on this. He claims flatly that nobody beyond the borders of the United States believe anything we say. Full stop. He points to a history, as he sees it, of the U.S. having broken our word and deliberately misled and lied on numerous occasions, leading to widespread and fundamental erosion of credibility. And this isn't just about adversaries. It's about a deep-seated distrust that, from his viewpoint presented in these sources, extends to both traditional allies and rivals alike.
He uses a pretty striking metaphor for this, doesn't he? Patient zero.
He does. It's a powerful and disturbing concept. America being viewed globally as patient zero. This isn't just some catchy phrase, it's a deeply unsettling metaphor he uses. He likens the U.S. to a large-scale drug addict who has cravings, mood changes, acts on impulse that is completely unpredictable. This suggests a nation whose actions are seen internationally as erratic, driven by internal compulsions and external pressures rather than, say, rational strategic calculation or predictable diplomacy.
And he gives examples of this perception.
Yes, he illustrates this with specific examples mentioned in the source material. South Koreans and Japanese long-standing, vital allies reportedly backing out of conference invitations, viewing the U.S., as Macgregor claims they do, as unstable and dangerous, unquote. The perception he has is that the U.S. is disconnected from real reality, with people internationally saying things like, "How did it ever get to this point? These people have lost their minds," end quote. It's a perception of America as, well, crazy and unreliable, which is hardly the image a global leader wants to project, and certainly one that undermines its influence and effectiveness.
So how do specific adversaries like Russia or China view the U.S. through this patient zero lens, according to Macgregor?
Well, for Russia, the Kremlin, according to his assessment, views President Trump specifically as impulsive, short-term in his thinking. Someone primarily focused on, quote, the so-called win that he can get out of this for himself here at home. Domestic politics trumping strategy. Macgregor believes they have pretty much given up on us, seeing the U.S. as fundamentally unpredictable and dangerously unreliable. And this perception, he argues, leads them to take measures against you that you may not care for, suggesting a strategic shift away from direct engagement toward the more cautious, long-term strategy of anticipation and mitigation against perceived U.S. instability.
And China, what's their perspective according to this analysis?
China's perspective, as detailed by Macgregor, is equally concerning and reflects a similar level of distrust. Beijing apparently views the U.S. as a power in decline that is lashing out as it goes down, end quote. And as a result, they no longer take U.S. propositions seriously. Macgregor highlights what he sees as a key disconnect here: China's genuine disinterest, in his view, in invading Taiwan. contrasting it sharply with the persistent U.S. insistence on such a threat being central to its Asia policy. This, he argues, shows a picture of the world that is divorced from geostrategic reality, with the U.S. operating under assumptions that he believes simply do not align with Beijing's actual strategic calculations. So both China and Russia are seen from this perspective as operating with a long-term calculated approach, while the U.S. is perceived as acting erratically, defensively, and sort of detached from the actual geopolitical landscape.
Beyond these major powers, Macgregor observes a broader global shift, something challenging traditional U.S. alliances.
Yes, he notes a significant global trend that directly challenges those traditional assumptions. He points to a striking trend of nations rallying to Iran, particularly Muslim countries, which dramatically reverses previous long-standing alliances and assumptions about Middle Eastern dynamics. This stands in stark contrast, he says, to the ingrained U.S. assumption that, in conflicts like this, everybody's the enemy of Iran. The world, he contends, isn't neatly dividing into simple pro-U.S. and anti-U.S. camps anymore, but rather forming new, complex alignments based on perceived regional realities, shared grievances especially stemming from the Gaza conflict, and a growing skepticism of U.S. leadership.
And this external perception of America as patient zero, unstable, disconnected, Macgregor warns it's made worse by something happening internally in the U.S.
Yes. Gravely compounded, he warns, by a dangerous internal disconnect within the United States itself. He suggests the American public just isn't paying sufficient attention to these critical foreign policy realities and their profound implications. Largely, as he puts it rather bluntly, worried about whether or not he can get a six-pack of beer tonight and watch the game on TV. A kind of disengagement. There's a pervasive and dangerous assumption, he claims, that war is something that happens on someone else's soil, always somewhere else, leading to a profound unpreparedness for the potential domestic consequences of current foreign policy decisions. This he does, yes. He connects these expensive and potentially destabilizing foreign policy decisions to what he sees as an alarming financial situation. A nation printing money as though it doesn't matter, warning that the treasury market is going to implode, and citing looming sovereign debt issues that threaten the nation's economic stability. He even brings in the viewpoint of Nassim Taleb, the renowned statistician and author. Taleb, according to Macgregor, believes the dollar is no longer viewed as a store of value, with gold increasingly becoming the official global reserve currency. So this paints a grim picture. A nation financially overstretched, increasingly vulnerable, yet still pursuing costly and potentially destabilizing foreign engagements. It's a precarious balancing act, and one that, according to Macgregor's analysis, is nearing its breaking point, with potentially severe repercussions for every American.
So looking at this dangerous path forward, Macgregor challenges some basic assumptions about military power, right? Particularly air power.
Absolutely. He fundamentally challenges the assumption that naval power and air power alone can cause the unconditional surrender of a country like Iran. He stresses Iran's status as a large continental power, almost the size of Western Europe, comparing it sharply to Israel, which he describes geographically as a postage stamp. This vast difference in size and terrain, he argues, profoundly impacts military strategy. It makes the idea of an easy, air-only campaign for unconditional surrender purely an illusion, in his view. Iran, he argues, is simply too vast, too mountainous, too resilient for such a strategy to succeed easily.
And Iran isn't exactly defenseless either, according to this analysis.
Far from it. Macgregor points out their substantial missile arsenal, reportedly over 3,000, with only a fraction used so far in recent conflicts. He emphasizes that Iran's far more technologically advanced today than it was even, say, 20 years ago, possessing the capability for indigenous production of cheap, effective drones and missiles. This means they can sustain a protracted conflict and retaliate effectively, making the idea of some easy knockout blow purely fantasy, according to him. Furthermore, he highlights what he calls the critical issue of Israel reportedly running out of interceptor missiles for its Iron Dome defense system, potentially in less than 2 weeks, forcing them, he claims, to ration their interceptor missiles, which obviously renders their defenses increasingly ineffective against sustained Iranian missile barrages. He also notes Iran's apparent calibrated campaign, designed to cause pain without causing a full collapse. A strategic choice, he suggests, that demonstrates a keen understanding of the geopolitical chessboard and an effort to avoid triggering full-scale U.S. intervention.
And the risks of escalation here, they sound truly chilling in his assessment.
They really are. Macgregor warns about, well, alarming discussions he's heard of regarding minimal residual radiation warheads or low-yield nuclear warheads. being considered potentially for penetrating deep Iranian facilities, a concept he unequivocally calls a very bad idea. He doesn't shy away from the horrific specter of Israel, perhaps in desperation, potentially using nuclear weapons, and the dire, unimaginable consequences of a nuclear detonation in the region. Such an event, he warns, would inevitably provoke a nuclear response against Israel itself, creating an apocalyptic scenario for the entire Middle East and, frankly, the world. This is, in his view, the ultimate Pandora's box that the current policy direction threatens to open.
And the risk isn't just regional, it extends directly to U.S. personnel and assets.
Directly. He points out the U.S. military bases in Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, some already partially evacuated, indicating awareness of the vulnerability, are easily identifiable and highly vulnerable targets for Iranian retaliation. Even U.S. capital ships, aircraft carriers, often seen as symbols of American invincibility, are, in Macgregor's words, not invulnerable or invincible to modern missile and drone technologies. They could be hit. And the economic impact on the U.S., should this conflict escalate significantly, would also be severe and immediate. Potential for a deep economic downturn, maybe even a full financial implosion, and gas prices soaring to unthinkable levels, perhaps $7 a gallon, maybe more, leading inevitably to widespread public anger and instability right here at home. This isn't just a foreign war. It has direct, profound, and painful domestic repercussions for every American.
The regional dynamics are also shifting dramatically, according to Macgregor.
Yes. Shifting regional dynamics play a crucial role in this dangerous path forward he outlines. He observes a significant sea shift in the Middle East, with Gulf countries increasingly showing support for Iran, directly challenging the traditional U.S.-backed order and alliances. The Abraham Accords, which aim to normalize relations and legitimize Israel's recognition by Arab and Muslim countries, well, they are now, in his assessment, basically shot, undone due to overwhelming public outrage across the region over the ongoing conflict in Gaza. This is a profound diplomatic setback, undermining years of U.S. efforts to reshape regional alliances.
And other countries are getting involved too. Pakistan, Egypt.
Right. He notes Pakistan's strong and very public warning of a nuclear response if Israel uses nuclear weapons first, signifying broad external support for Iran from major powers like China and other Arab countries, creating kind of counterblock. Furthermore, he points out the extremely dangerous position of leaders like King Abdullah of Jordan and President al-Sisi of Egypt. They face populations intensely enraged by the events in Gaza. These leaders are at severe risk of removal by their own people, he suggests. And this pressure could potentially lead Egypt, a critical regional player, to intervene militarily if Israel's actions push them too far. So the regional landscape, he argues, is shifting rapidly. Old alliances are fracturing, and new, potentially volatile power blocks are emerging against the traditional U.S.-led order.
Okay, so given this really dire outlook, this complex web of influences and consequences he describes, what's the alternative? Does Macgregor propose a different path?
He does. Colonel Macgregor, in the sources, proposes a 5-step solution, a different path forward for U.S. foreign policy. First, he advocates for an emergency UN Security Council meeting to secure an immediate ceasefire. With Washington explicitly opposing the destruction of any state in the Middle East, that's a crucial point, includes both Iran and Israel, protecting all existing states. It's about setting a foundational baseline for de-escalation, a commitment to peaceful coexistence, shifting from a policy of imposed outcomes to one of preserving states.
Okay, step 1 is ceasefire and state preservation. What's next?
Second, he suggests demanding that Israel immediately stop the killing of Palestinians and withdraw its forces from both Gaza and the West Bank. This directly addresses the core humanitarian crisis and a major catalyst for regional instability, trying to de-escalate the immediate conflict on the ground. Third, he advocates for suspending all military aid to Israel until these demands are met, and until humanitarian assistance is fully permitted to enter Gaza without obstruction. This is presented as a powerful use of U.S. leverage, aiming to enforce compliance with humanitarian norms and international law through economic and military pressure.
So, stop the violence, withdraw forces, suspend aid until compliance. What are the last 2 steps?
Fourth, he proposes securing Gaza itself with armed forces from non-aligned nations, explicitly excluding the U.S. or Western Europe. This is a critical nuance in his proposal. It aims to ensure neutrality, avoid perpetuating the perception of Western interventionism or bias, and thereby potentially gain more trust from regional actors. Finally, and crucially, he suggests convening a great power conference. This would include the United States, Russia, China, India, and Brazil, acknowledging their enormous economic, political, and ultimately military influence on the global stage today. The goal here is to seek a mutually supported solution rather than attempting to impose a hegemonic one from Washington. moving away from unilateralism towards a more collaborative approach to global problem solving. A real shift in how the world order might function.
So wrapping this all up, Colonel Macgregor's deep dive into the recent Iran bombing and his broader analysis of U.S. foreign policy, as presented in these sources, it really offers a grave warning. He contends that America is being dragged into a war that does not serve the interests of the American people, but rather those of a foreign elite using our leaders as instrument.
Oh.
That's a stark and, deeply uncomfortable accusation, highlighting what he sees as a profound disconnect between the perceived national interest and the actions actually being taken on the global stage.
Absolutely. And the consequences of continuing on the current path, as painted by Macgregor in these sources, are presented in vivid, dire terms: potential for catastrophic military losses, significant domestic economic turmoil, and further global isolation for the U.S. If the U.S. persists, they argue, in ignoring geopolitical realities and the profound domestic consequences of these policies, the fallout could be truly immense, undermining its standing and stability for decades to come.
So it leaves us with a really challenging question, doesn't it? If America is indeed perceived, rightly or wrongly, as this patient zero, unpredictable, disconnected from reality by both allies and adversaries alike, what fundamental shift in its own self-perception, its understanding of its place in the world, is actually necessary to regain trust and stability? What does it truly mean to lead on a world stage where, as these sources suggest, maybe bullying works no longer, and where genuine engagement and a real understanding of complex realities are paramount? It's a question that challenges the very foundation of current American foreign policy. And it invites you, the listener, to consider a future built perhaps on something far more sustainable than just force and deception.